The moment I stepped into the ballroom, I knew I had made a mistake coming. The music softened just enough for me to hear her voice before I even saw her face. My younger sister leaned toward her bridesmaids, one manicured hand cupped around a champagne flute, and whispered with a smile sharp enough to cut glass. "The stinky country girl is here." They laughed. Not politely, not quietly. The kind of laughter meant to travel. I stood there just inside the doors of her engagement party, the glow of chandeliers washing over silk dresses and polished smiles, feeling every eye skim past me and then dismiss me. To them, I was exactly what she said. The awkward older sister from a nowhere town, invited because someone felt they had to invite me, not because anyone wanted me there. I didn't belong among crystal centerpieces and valet tickets tucked into leather clutches. What none of them knew, what my sister certainly didn't know, was that this entire evening rested on decisions I had made years ago. Decisions signed quietly, structured carefully, buried under layers of legal language and trusts that didn't carry my name. They saw a woman who had left and failed. I saw a room built on assumptions. And as I took my first step forward, I realized this night wasn't going to end the way my sister planned. The ballroom was beautiful in the way money always tries to be convincing. Tall arrangements of white roses climbed toward the ceiling. A string quartet played something soft and familiar. Servers glided through the room like they had practiced smiling in mirrors. Everything had been chosen to suggest ease, success, and permanence. This was the life my sister had been preparing for since she was old enough to understand what admiration looked like. I adjusted the strap of my bag on my shoulder and walked in as if I had every right to be there. I did, technically. My name was on the invitation, printed in the same raised lettering as everyone else's. It just didn't feel that way. My sister was easy to spot. She always had been. She stood near the center of the room, laughing with her fiancé, her hand resting on his arm in a way that said ownership and pride. She looked perfect. Hair smooth, makeup, flawless dress tailored to highlight everything she had learned was valuable about herself. She had been raised to shine, and she knew exactly how to stand in the light. I caught a glimpse of our parents nearby, my mother holding court with a small group of women she'd already decided were important. My father nodding along, glass in hand, wearing the satisfied expression of a man who believed things had turned out the way they were supposed to. They looked happy. Relieved even, as if this engagement was proof that they had done something right. No one noticed me at first, and that was familiar. I had learned a long time ago how to enter rooms quietly, how to take up as little space as possible. It wasn't shyness, it was survival. When you grow up being told you're too much or not enough, depending on the day, you learn to hover at the edges. A server passed by with a tray of champagne flutes. I took one out of habit, more for something to do with my hands than any desire to drink. I scanned the room slowly, letting my eyes take in the details, the venue, the staff, the flow of the evening. Old instincts stirred the ones that had nothing to do with family and everything to do with structure and planning. My sister finally noticed me. Her smile tightened for just a second before she smoothed it out and turned back to her friends. She didn't wave. She didn't acknowledge me. The message was clear. I was background. I always had been. Growing up, she had been the easy child, the one who knew how to charm adults and perform gratitude on cue. I was the older one, the complicated one, the girl who asked questions and wanted explanations. My parents used to say she was low maintenance, like that was a virtue instead of a warning sign. I was told I'd understand when I was older. I did. I understood that ease was rewarded and resistance was not. I moved farther into the room and found a spot near the edge close enough to see without being pulled into conversation. A few people glanced at me, curious but uninterested. I didn't recognize most of them, which made sense. This was my sister's world now, her friends, her future. I had been edited out of the picture long before tonight. As I stood there listening to the murmur of voices and clinking glasses, a familiar sensation settled over me. The feeling of being underestimated. It used to hurt. used to make my chest tight with a mix of shame and anger. Now it felt different, quieter, almost useful. My phone buzzed in my bag, a vibration I felt more than heard. I didn't check it right away. Whatever it was could wait. Tonight wasn't about reacting, it was about watching. A guest near me commented on how beautiful everything looked, how my sister was lucky, how our parents must be so proud. I smiled politely and said nothing. People like compliments that don't challenge their assumptions. I thought about the invitation that had arrived weeks ago, late and almost apologetic. My mother had called afterward, her voice careful, telling me she hoped I could make it, that it would mean a lot to the family. She hadn't said it would mean a lot to my sister. Or to me. Just the family, like a concept, something that needed to appear whole. I had almost declined. It would have been easy to send regrets to stay home and avoid the familiar ache. But something had stopped me, a sense that this moment mattered even if no one else understood why yet. My sister laughed again, louder this time, and the room responded. She thrived on that energy. I wondered if she felt secure standing there or if she was already afraid of losing it. Sometimes the people who shine the brightest are the ones most terrified of the dark. I took a slow sip of champagne and let my gaze drift back to the room. The music swelled. A toast would come later. Speeches. Promises about the future. Words layered on top of assumptions stacked carefully like a house no one had tested. I didn't feel angry anymore. I felt steady. I knew why I was there now. Not to confront, not to beg for acknowledgement, but to let the evening unfold exactly as it would, to see who reached for what they believed was theirs, and to be ready when it became clear that belief wasn't enough. I stayed where I was, invisible and calm, while my sister basked in the certainty of a future she thought was locked in. And as the night moved forward, I understood something with perfect clarity. Being underestimated had given me time, and time, I had learned, was the most powerful thing in the room. Watching my sister move through the ballroom so easily pulled me backward the way certain smells or songs always do. I saw her laughing, touching arms, leaning in just enough to make people feel chosen, and without meaning to. I was back in our childhood kitchen, standing at the counter while she sat at the table, already finished with her homework, already praised. She had always been the daughter who made things easier. Teachers loved her. Neighbors remembered her name. Relatives pinched her cheeks and said how lucky our parents were. When she forgot something, it was charming. When I questioned something, it was exhausting. I learned early that effort counted less than grace, and grace was something she seemed to have been born with. There was a school assembly when we were kids, one of those ceremonies meant to celebrate achievement. My sister received an award for natural leadership. The principal talked about how some children just shine without trying. I remember clapping until my hands hurt because that's what good sisters did. Later that same year, I stayed up night after night studying for an advanced exam. When I passed, my mother smiled and said she was proud of me for working so hard. Not shining, working. At family gatherings, the pattern repeated itself in small, quiet ways. If my sister spoke, people listened. If I spoke, conversations shifted. If she had an opinion, it was interesting. If I had one, it was complicated. No one was cruel about it. That's what made it harder to name. It was comfort, not malice. Choosing the child who fit best into the picture they wanted to see. My parents liked harmony. They liked things that moved smoothly without friction. My sister gave them that. I didn't mean to disrupt it, but I did. I asked why. I noticed inconsistencies. I wanted explanations instead of reassurances. Over time, they stopped engaging and started managing me, encouraging independence before I asked for it, praising my strength as if it were a reason not to support me. When I left home, they told everyone how proud they were of my courage, how I didn't need help, how I was always capable. They said it so often they began to believe it. And because they believed it, they felt justified in giving my sister what she wanted, what she needed, what would make her life easier. I was fine. I always was. There was one conversation I still carried with me, one that came back now as I watched my sister accept congratulations from strangers. We were sitting in the living room years ago, the afternoon light slanting across the carpet. My parents explained a decision they'd already made, something logistical, temporary. They said it made sense for her to handle it, that she was closer, that she was settled. I remember the way they said my name gently, as if preparing me for disappointment was a kindness. I hadn't argued. I nodded. I told them I understood. I told them it was fine. And in that moment, I realized something that would shape the rest of my life. My ability to cope had become their excuse to overlook me. Back in the ballroom, my sister lifted her hand to show her ring again, the stone catching the light. People gasped and smiled and leaned closer. She had practiced this moment. She had been waiting for it. I wondered if she remembered all the times I had stood beside her applauding her successes while swallowing my own wants. She glanced in my direction briefly, just long enough to register that I was still there. Her expression didn't change. To her, I wasn't a threat. I was history, a chapter she believed was already closed. I moved toward a quieter corner and set my empty glass on a passing tray. My chest felt tight, not with jealousy, but with clarity. It wasn't just that she had been favored. It was that the family had built a narrative around that favoritism and never questioned it. She was the one who stayed. I was the one who left. She was the one who needed protecting. I was the one who could handle herself. They had all made choices based on those labels, and tonight was the result. As a child, I had thought if I just tried harder, if I became easier, I might earn the same ease she seemed to move through the world with. As an adult, I understood that the rules had never been fair. They had been convenient. I watched my parents laugh with her future in-laws nodding along as if everything about this evening made sense. They didn't look worried. They looked relieved. As if this engagement tied up loose ends they hadn't known how to manage. As if it proved that the way they had divided their attention, their trust, their resources had been justified all along. That was when it hit me, standing there in a room full of strangers celebrating a future I wasn't meant to be part of. This night wasn't just about my sister's happiness. It was about validation. For her. For them. Proof that the choices they'd made, the way they'd treated us differently, had led to the right outcome. I felt something settle inside me then, something solid and unmovable. My sister didn't see me as competition because she never had to. She believed the story she'd been told, that she had won simply by being herself, and that I had opted out by leaving. She had no idea how dangerous that belief was. I straightened my shoulders and took one last look at her, surrounded by admiration. She had everything she thought she wanted, balanced on assumptions no one had bothered to test. And for the first time, I wasn't standing in the background wondering how it had happened. I was standing still, fully aware that the gap between what she believed and what was real was wider than anyone in that room understood. The longer I stayed in the ballroom, the clearer it became that something about this engagement didn't sit right with me. At first, I thought it was just old resentment resurfacing, the familiar discomfort of being back in a room where I had never quite belonged. But as I watched more closely, that explanation stopped being enough. My sister's fiancé was standing near the bar, laughing a little too loudly at jokes that weren't funny. He had the look of a man trying to appear relaxed while calculating every move. His hand never strayed far from his jacket pocket where his phone sat like a second heartbeat. Every few minutes he glanced toward the doors, then back at the crowd as if he were waiting for something or someone. His parents were nearby, working the room with practiced ease. They smiled often, but their smiles didn't quite reach their eyes. They asked questions that sounded polite on the surface but circled the same themes over and over. How long had our family lived in the area? Who handled financial decisions? Whether the venue was booked through a personal contact or a long-standing relationship. They never asked anything outright, but they listened very carefully to the answers. I positioned myself close enough to hear without being obvious. Years of learning how to exist quietly had given me a talent for that. I sipped another glass of champagne I didn't want and let their voices wash over me. My mother, eager as always to present a picture of stability, talked about how things had always worked out for our family. She spoke about planning, about being careful, about how proud she was that both her daughters were settled in their own ways. The phrase landed wrong. Settled meant something very specific in her vocabulary, and it didn't apply equally to both of us. The fiancé's mother nodded along her expression, attentive. "That kind of consistency is so important," she said. "Especially when you're thinking long-term. Family support makes all the difference." She glanced toward my sister, who was laughing with a group of friends, then back to my mother. "It's wonderful to know there's a solid foundation." A solid foundation. I felt my jaw tighten. They weren't talking about love. They weren't even talking about compatibility. They were talking about access, about reassurance, about what they assumed would come naturally once a wedding turned two families into one. My sister floated over, radiant and distracted, kissing her future mother-in-law on the cheek before being pulled away again. She looked happy, or at least convincing. Watching her, I realized she had no idea how closely she was being evaluated. She thought this was about celebration. She didn't see the quiet measurements being taken all around her. The music shifted, and a server passed by offering hors d'oeuvres I didn't recognize. I took one more to occupy myself, then out of appetite, and continued watching. The fiancé's father leaned in toward my dad, lowering his voice. I couldn't hear every word, but I caught enough. "After everything's official," he said, "there's more flexibility. It's easier to move forward when everyone's aligned." Aligned. Another word that meant more than it said. My father nodded, eager to agree, though I could tell he didn't fully understand what he was agreeing to. He rarely liked to admit when things went over his head. He preferred optimism to clarity, confidence to questions. I felt a slow, cold realization begin to form. These people weren't reckless. They weren't foolish. They were making a calculated bet based on what they thought they knew about our family. And what they thought they knew came from stories my parents had told, assumptions my sister had never challenged, and silence I had maintained for years. At one point, the fiancé caught my eye. Just for a second. His gaze flickered over me with mild curiosity before sliding away. I wasn't important to him. Not yet. I was just part of the background, another relative to be accounted for and then forgotten. That was when I noticed the urgency beneath their politeness. The fiancé's mother checked her watch more than once. His father stepped away to take a phone call. His voice low and tight, his smile returning only after he hung up. When he rejoined the group, he laughed louder than before, as if volume could erase whatever he'd just heard. This engagement wasn't just wanted, it was needed. The thought settled heavily in my chest. People don't rush certainty unless something else is pressing in from behind. I wondered what kind of pressure could make a family invest so heavily in appearances and timing, in the assumption that marriage would smooth things over. My sister reappeared beside me unexpectedly, her perfume sharp and floral. "You okay?" she asked, her tone light, but her eyes scanning my face as if checking for damage. "I'm fine," I said. It wasn't a lie. Not anymore. She nodded, already half turned away. "I'm glad you could come," she added, the words polite and empty. "It means a lot to Mom." There it was. Not to her. To Mom. She disappeared back into the crowd, her laughter rising again like a cue on schedule. I watched her go, thinking about how little she knew about the people she was tying herself to, and how confident she was that everything would fall into place once the ring was on her finger. I excused myself and moved toward the edge of the room, closer to a hallway leading away from the noise. I needed a moment to think, to separate old hurt from new information. This wasn't just a family gathering that made me uncomfortable. It was a convergence of misunderstandings, all pointing in the same direction. The fiancé's family believed they were stepping into something secure. My parents believed they were handing off responsibility at last. My sister believed she had arrived at the life she was promised, and none of them understood where control actually lived. I leaned against the wall and let the sounds of the party blur together. Laughter, glasses clinking, music swelling and fading. It all felt strangely distant, like a performance I was watching from behind glass. If I left now, no one would stop me. They would notice eventually, maybe mention it the next day, and move on. The night would continue exactly as planned, the assumptions intact, the future marching forward on a foundation that didn't exist. I straightened and pushed away from the wall. I wasn't ready to act yet, not openly, not emotionally, but I was done pretending that this was just about old family wounds. Something bigger was unfolding, and for the first time since I'd arrived, I understood my place in it. Not as a guest, not as a sister trying to be seen, but as the one person in that room who knew this engagement was built on a misunderstanding that would not survive contact with the truth. I noticed it when a man I didn't recognize raised his glass and congratulated my sister on taking over the family side of things. He said it casually, smiling like it was common knowledge, like it was settled. My sister laughed a little, breathless with excitement, and nodded as if she agreed. Something in my chest went cold. He went on about how capable she was, how lucky everyone was that she'd stepped up, how reassuring it must be for her fiancé's family to know she was the one handling matters now. He spoke with confidence, the kind that comes from having been told a version of the story more than once. My sister accepted the praise easily, already used to being seen as the responsible one. I stood there, my smile fixed, while a familiar realization sank in. This wasn't just perception. This was transfer. Years ago, my parents had called me into the living room one evening, the same room where we had celebrated birthdays and watched movies and pretended we were closer than we were. They sat side by side on the couch, hands folded, faces serious in the way that always meant they'd already decided something. They explained it slowly, gently. There were some practical matters to sort out, they said. Nothing dramatic, just an adjustment. They talked about convenience and proximity, about how my sister was nearby and settled, and how it made sense for her to handle certain responsibilities. They assured me it was temporary, that it didn't change anything important. I remember asking a question, my voice careful. I asked what would happen later. They exchanged a look, the kind that said I was making things harder than they needed to be. My mother smiled and said, "You're independent. You don't need this the way she does." That sentence had followed me for years. Back then, I told them I understood. I said it was fine. I didn't fight it because fighting had never worked. I had already learned that resistance only made people label you difficult. And I had learned that being labeled difficult came with consequences. Standing in the ballroom now, watching my sister accept congratulations for something that had once been mine to oversee, I realized how neatly that temporary decision had become permanent. No one had circled back. No one had asked if circumstances had changed. They had simply moved forward without me building expectations on top of a quiet redirection that suited them all. My sister was talking animatedly now, gesturing as she described future plans. She spoke with certainty, using language that suggested authority. She had been given access without ever being told what it cost. She didn't sound malicious. She sounded confident, like someone who had never been asked to question why something was handed to her. I caught the reaction of her fiancé's parents as they listened. Their interest sharpened. They leaned in slightly, exchanging glances that were quick but telling. This was what they had been waiting to hear. Confirmation. Proof that the assumptions they'd made weren't assumptions at all, but facts. A strange calm settled over me as I watched it happen. The anger I might have felt years ago didn't come. Instead, there was clarity. This wasn't about jealousy. It wasn't about wanting credit or praise. It was about structure. About how quietly decisions could reshape entire futures when no one bothered to check who actually held the pieces together. I moved closer, not to interrupt, but to listen. My sister mentioned how everything would be simpler once the wedding happened, how it would all be streamlined. The word landed heavily. Streamlined for whom, I wondered. And based on what authority? She laughed, brushing off a question with a wave of her hand, and said it was all taken care of. I knew she believed that. She believed because she had always been protected from the details. She had been taught to trust the surface of things. I looked toward my parents. My mother watched my sister with pride, her face soft with relief. My father nodded along as if hearing a familiar story told again reassured him that nothing had gone wrong. They weren't scheming. They weren't cruel. They were comfortable. And comfort had always mattered more to them than fairness. That was when it became painfully clear. What had been taken from me wasn't just a role or a responsibility. It was the chance to be seen as someone whose presence mattered. My reliability had been mistaken for availability. My silence had been mistaken for consent. I stepped away from the group and let out a slow breath. The music swelled again, covering the sound of my thoughts. I realized that if I did nothing, what I was witnessing would solidify. Promises would be made. Plans would be built. And the quiet redirection that had started years ago would become the foundation for an entire marriage. My sister would stand at the center of it, believing she was finally in control, never knowing that what she had been given wasn't hers to give away. And when the consequences came, they wouldn't land where they belonged. They would land on everyone, including me. I looked around the room once more at the guests laughing at the families, blending at the future being sketched out in broad, confident strokes. The insult from earlier echoed faintly in my mind, no longer sharp, just ironic. They thought I was the country girl who didn't belong, the one who had left and faded into the background. They thought I had nothing to lose here. What they didn't understand was that something had already been taken from me quietly and without asking, and I was standing in the middle of the consequences of that choice, watching as the last pieces were put into place. If I stayed silent, this wouldn't just be my sister's engagement. It would be the moment my absence was made permanent. I stepped away from the ballroom under the excuse of needing fresh air, though what I really needed was distance. The music and laughter blurred together behind me as I moved down the softly lit hallway, my heels quiet against the carpet. This part of the venue was meant for privacy for guests who needed a moment away from celebration. I doubted anyone would notice my absence. I was almost past the corner when I heard voices ahead, low and urgent. I slowed without thinking, instinct taking over. Years of being overlooked had taught me how to listen without being seen. "After everything's official, it'll be much easier," a man said. His voice was controlled, practiced. "People loosen up once the wedding happens. Doors open." Another voice answered, softer but tense. "We just need them aligned. That's all. Once the families are connected, no one questions access." I stopped completely, my hand resting lightly against the wall. They were standing just around the corner out of sight. I didn't need to see their faces to recognize them. My sister's future in-laws. The same smiles. The same careful confidence I'd been watching all evening. "This engagement is important," the woman continued. "Timing matters. We can't afford delays." There it was. Not romance, not excitement. Urgency. I held my breath as they spoke their words, falling into place one after another, forming a picture I hadn't wanted but couldn't ignore. They talked about alignment and flexibility, about how things would move forward once everything was formalized. They never mentioned my sister by name. Not once. They spoke as if she were a bridge, not a person, a means to something that already existed in their minds. I shifted slightly, the faintest sound of fabric against skin. One of them cleared his throat. "We're assuming cooperation," he said. "The family seems accommodating." Accommodating. My jaw tightened. They weren't planning anything illegal. They didn't need to. They were counting on habits, on politeness, on the way families like mine smoothed things over instead of asking uncomfortable questions. They believed access would come quietly, naturally, the way it always had when someone was confident enough to take it. A phone buzzed. The woman let out a sharp breath. "We don't have much room to maneuver anymore," she said. "This has to work." The man murmured something I couldn't hear, his tone firm but strained. When he spoke again, his voice had shifted, brightened as if he were already rehearsing the smile he'd wear when they returned to the party. "We're close," he said. Just stay calm. Tonight is about optics. Optics. The word echoed in my head as they moved away. Footsteps retreating toward the ballroom. I stayed where I was for several seconds, my heart steady but my thoughts racing. When I finally exhaled, it felt like coming up from underwater. So that was it. This wasn't about love or blending families. It was about positioning. About creating the appearance of unity so that no one would question the next steps. They believed my family would be open, agreeable, grateful even. They believed marriage would blur boundaries that had never been clearly defined to begin with. And they were right about one thing. My family had always been easy to maneuver. I straightened and walked the rest of the hallway, pushing through the door that led to a small terrace overlooking the city. The cool night air hit my face, grounding me. Below, traffic moved in neat lines, headlights blinking like distant signals. Everything continued orderly and indifferent. I leaned against the railing and closed my eyes for a moment. The pieces were fitting together now, and I didn't like the picture they formed. My sister believed she was stepping into security. My parents believed they were handing off responsibility at last. And my sister's future in-laws believed they were about to gain access to something they'd never actually traced. They had built their confidence on stories, on assumptions, on silence. I thought about all the times my parents had spoken for me, had framed my absence as independence, my quiet as consent. I thought about how easy it had been for others to decide what I was willing to give simply because I didn't argue anymore. That pattern had taught people they could move forward without me. I opened my eyes and looked back toward the ballroom through the glass doors. Inside, the party continued. My sister laughed, unaware of the conversation that had just taken place. She looked radiant, convinced that everything was finally falling into place. I felt a twist of something in my chest that wasn't quite pity and wasn't quite anger. It was recognition. This was the moment where staying silent would stop being neutral. It would become a choice with consequences. If I walked away tonight and let this engagement lock itself into place, whatever came next wouldn't be a misunderstanding. It would be a slow, polite erosion. Requests framed as favors. Expectations disguised as family support. And when things eventually collapsed under the weight of assumptions, the blame would scatter outward, landing wherever it was most convenient. I knew how that story ended. I'd been living versions of it my entire life. I pushed off the railing and headed back inside my steps, measured my expression composed. As I re-entered the ballroom, the noise rushed back to meet me. Music, laughter, applause as someone clinked a glass to get attention. My sister caught sight of me and smiled briefly, a reflex she'd perfected. To her, I was still just a guest, a relative to be managed, someone who would watch and then fade away again. She had no idea what I had just heard. And for the first time that night, I understood exactly what was at stake. This wasn't about reclaiming something I'd lost years ago. It was about stopping a mistake from becoming permanent. I took my place at the edge of the room, once more invisible and alert, knowing that from this point on, everything hinged on whether I chose to remain what they thought I was. Because once marriage entered the picture, silence would no longer be an option. Once I knew what to look for, I couldn't stop seeing it. The questions weren't random. The glances weren't casual. My sister's future in-laws weren't celebrating a love story. They were tracing lines, testing boundaries, trying to locate the center of gravity in a family they believed was stable, predictable, and quietly wealthy. They had built a version of us in their minds, a family that paid its bills without stress, a household where decisions were made smoothly and resources appeared when needed. A family that didn't argue about money because there was enough of it to avoid conflict. They had learned this version from my parents' stories, from my sister's confidence, and from the absence of any visible strain. What they hadn't learned was where that illusion came from. I watched my father speak with my sister's fiancé near the bar. His posture relaxed, his voice warm. He was explaining how things had always worked themselves out for us, how planning and cooperation went a long way. He sounded proud, grateful. I wondered if he had any idea how thin that certainty really was. My mother joined them, nodding along, adding details that made the picture even smoother. She talked about how she never worried about emergencies, how support always appeared when it was needed. She said it like it was a virtue, like it was proof of good character and good choices. I felt a familiar tightening in my chest. They didn't know how close things had come to falling apart more than once. They didn't know how carefully certain gaps had been bridged. They didn't know because I had made sure they didn't have to. Years ago, when I had finally found my footing, I had made a decision that felt simple at the time. I structured everything I built to stand apart, not out of spite, but out of necessity. I had learned early that when family knew too much, expectations followed. Entitlement crept in quietly, boundaries blurred. So I had chosen separation. Trusts instead of names, companies instead of personal accounts. Clear lines that couldn't be crossed without intention and consent. It wasn't secrecy, it was protection. For me and for them, even if they never understood that. Standing in that ballroom watching assumptions form in real time, I realized how thoroughly that separation had been misunderstood. My independence had been interpreted as abundance. My distance had been translated into shared security. Because money never arrived with my name attached, it had become communal in their minds. Invisible, therefore available. My sister's fiancé's mother approached my parents again, her tone light but her focus sharp. She mentioned future possibilities, spoke about collaboration and flexibility, about how much easier things were when families supported one another. My mother smiled, eager to agree, eager to be seen as generous. I wanted to interrupt, to explain, to clarify that nothing moved without intention, that nothing was automatic. But I didn't. Not yet. Because I understood something important in that moment. This wasn't a misunderstanding that could be cleared up with a conversation. This was a belief system. And belief systems don't collapse politely. My sister drifted over, linking her arm through her fiancé's, glowing with confidence. She talked about how everything would be simpler once they were married, how life would finally feel settled. The word settled echoed in my mind, heavy and misleading. She believed marriage would stabilize everything, that it would smooth over uncertainty, align interests, make the future predictable. She believed because she had always been protected from instability. She had never had to trace consequences to their source. Her fiancé nodded along, his smile fixed, his eyes alert. I saw the calculation there now, the way he listened for what wasn't being said. He believed that once vows were exchanged, doors would open without resistance. That support would be expected, not requested. He wasn't wrong about how families like ours worked. He was wrong about who held the keys. As the evening wore on, I felt the weight of what silence would cost. Not immediately, not dramatically, but over time. Small favors, temporary accommodations, requests framed as necessities, each one reasonable on its own, each one building toward something that could not be easily undone. I thought about how easily blame would be assigned when things eventually strained. My parents would be confused, hurt. My sister would feel betrayed by outcomes she never anticipated. And somewhere in that mess, my name would surface quietly as the person who could have helped more, who could have stepped in sooner. I had lived that version of the story before. I wasn't willing to repeat it. I excused myself and found a quiet corner near the edge of the room, pulling my phone from my bag. I didn't make any calls. I didn't need to. Everything that mattered had been put in place long ago. Safeguards, timelines, conditions that existed whether anyone acknowledged them or not. Still seeing the assumptions unfold made those structures feel newly urgent. Once certain documents were signed, once certain expectations were cemented, reversing course would become complicated, not impossible but costly, emotionally, legally, personally. I looked up as my sister laughed again, her hand resting on her fiancé's chest, her future laid out in confident strokes. She believed security came from closeness, from being chosen, from fitting perfectly into the life she had been promised. I knew better. Security came from clarity, from knowing where authority ended and responsibility began, from boundaries that didn't shift under pressure or sentiment. I slipped my phone back into my bag and took a steady breath. I wasn't angry. I wasn't even sad. I was focused. This was no longer about reclaiming something that had been taken from me years ago. It was about preventing a slow, quiet erosion that would leave everyone pretending they didn't see it coming. I watched the room with new eyes now, each conversation revealing another layer of assumption, another unspoken expectation. The night moved forward unaware that it had already crossed a line. And as I stood there calm and unseen, I accepted a truth that settled firmly in my chest. If I did nothing, this wouldn't end in a single dramatic moment. It would unravel slowly, politely, with smiles and good intentions. And by the time anyone realized what had been lost, it would be far too late to put it back. I almost left. The thought came to me as I stood near the edge of the ballroom, watching the crowd swirl around my sister like she was the center of gravity. It would have been easy. I could slip out quietly the way I always had. Someone might notice later and mention it in passing. My mother would shrug and say I had work. My sister wouldn't ask questions. The night would continue exactly as planned. For a few minutes, the idea felt like relief. I imagined myself back in my car driving away while the music still played, the laughter fading behind me. I imagined waking up the next morning untouched by whatever came next. No responsibility, no confrontation, no reopening old wounds that had taken years to scar over properly. I had earned that distance. I had built a life where I didn't have to keep stepping into rooms that made me feel smaller. I turned toward the exit and took 2 slow steps in that direction before stopping. Something inside me resisted, not loudly, but firmly. It wasn't anger that held me back. It wasn't pride. It was a familiar, heavy understanding of how these things played out. Walking away would protect me in the short term, but it would also lock the story into place. I thought about what would happen next if I left. The engagement would turn into wedding planning. Conversations would shift from celebration to logistics. Requests would start small and sound reasonable. Help with this. Advice on that. Support framed as family duty. Everything presented as temporary, manageable, necessary. And when things eventually strained, as they always did when assumptions met reality, the blame would scatter. My parents would feel blindsided. My sister would feel betrayed by outcomes she never anticipated. And somewhere in that chaos, my name would surface quietly, as the person who could have stepped in sooner. Who should have said something? Who chose not to? I had carried that role before. The capable one. The one who could have handled it, if only she had tried harder. I wasn't willing to pick it up again. I leaned against a pillar and closed my eyes for a moment, grounding myself. A memory surfaced uninvited, sharp and clear. Years ago, sitting alone in a cramped apartment after a long day, realizing that no one was coming to fix things for me. That if I wanted stability, I had to build it myself. That lesson had been painful, but it had also been freeing. I opened my eyes and looked back at the room. My sister was mid-conversation with her fiancé's parents, nodding eagerly, her posture open and trusting. She wanted so badly to believe that love was enough to hold everything together. I didn't fault her for that. Wanting security didn't make her weak, but wanting it without understanding the cost made her vulnerable. My parents stood nearby, visibly relieved. This engagement meant they could stop worrying, stop juggling, stop explaining. It meant someone else was stepping into a role they had been quietly hoping to hand off. They weren't trying to hurt me. They were tired. And tired people make choices based on ease. I understood all of that. What I couldn't accept was letting those choices harden into permanence without challenge. Leaving wouldn't just be self-protection. It would be surrender. It would confirm every assumption that had been made about me, that I was distant, that I didn't care, that I would always adapt around decisions made without me. I straightened, feeling the weight of the decision settle into something solid. If I stayed, things would change. There was no version of this where I intervened and then returned to being invisible. The moment I moved, the story my family told about me would crack. I had to be willing to live with that. I didn't plan to shout. I didn't plan to warn anyone dramatically or beg them to listen. That had never worked before. What worked was structure, preparation, the quiet power of things already set in motion long before anyone realized they mattered. I thought about the safeguards I had put in place years ago, not knowing exactly when or why they would be needed. Back then, it had felt like caution. Now it felt like foresight. I hadn't created those boundaries to punish anyone. I had created them to protect myself from being folded into expectations that didn't belong to me. I glanced at my phone still tucked in my bag. I didn't need to call anyone yet. There was time, but not much. Certain moments couldn't be undone once they passed. Certain assumptions once acted upon became facts people refused to question. The band shifted into a slower song, the lights dimming slightly as couples moved closer together. The party was transitioning, sliding gently toward the next phase of the evening. I felt the clock start ticking in a way that had nothing to do with minutes. I took a steady breath and let the indecision fall away. I wasn't staying to save anyone. Not really. I was staying because silence in this case would cost more than speaking through action. Because walking away would mean watching the same pattern repeat itself, only with higher stakes and fewer exits. I chose to stay. Not as a sister hoping to be included, not as a daughter seeking approval, but as someone who understood exactly what was being assumed and was prepared to stop it before it became irreversible. As I moved back into the flow of the room, I felt something shift inside me. The anxiety eased, replaced by clarity. I didn't feel righteous. I didn't feel triumphant. I felt resolved. Whatever happened next, I would be able to live with it. I took my place once more at the edge of the celebration, calm and observant, knowing that the moment I acted, there would be no going back to the version of me everyone found so easy to ignore. And for the first time all night, that didn't feel like a loss. Once the decision settled, everything became quieter inside me. The noise of the party no longer pressed in the same way. I wasn't drifting anymore. I was moving even if no one else could see it yet. I checked my phone as casually as I could and stepped away from the ballroom, weaving between guests who were too busy celebrating to notice. I told a passing coordinator I needed to take a work call. She nodded without question. People like me, women, standing alone with phones in their hands, were invisible in rooms like this. The hallway outside the ballroom was cooler, dimmer. I walked until I reached a small lounge near the back, empty except for a decorative lamp and a pair of armchairs no one ever used. I sat, crossed my legs, and finally unlocked my phone. I didn't need to explain anything to anyone on the other end. That was the point. The people I worked with didn't need urgency or emotion. They needed clarity. I sent a single message to the trustee listed under my initials, not my name. Just a request to confirm status. No alarms, no changes yet. The response came quickly. Everything remained exactly as structured. That steadiness grounded me. Nothing was being created tonight. Nothing was being improvised. What mattered had been in place for years, waiting quietly for a moment when assumptions might overreach. I leaned back in the chair and let myself remember why I had built things this way. It wasn't because I wanted control over others. It was because I had learned how easily people reached for what they believed was shared, especially when family was involved. Once money became emotional, it stopped being rational. Once support became expected, it stopped being appreciated. So I had drawn lines early, clean ones, legal ones, the kind that didn't shift under pressure or guilt. Trust structures, clear authority, conditions that required explicit consent, not implied access. Marriage, I knew, didn't override any of it. It never had. What unsettled me now wasn't fear that someone could take something from me. It was the realization of how close they were to acting on beliefs that would make everything messier for everyone involved. I glanced at the time. The evening was moving along. Soon there would be another toast, another round of applause, another moment where plans for the future would be spoken out loud as if they were already secured. That was the window I needed to watch carefully. I stood and walked to the mirror mounted near the lounge entrance. I looked composed, calm, no visible cracks. The woman staring back at me wasn't bracing for confrontation. She was waiting. Back inside the ballroom, the energy had shifted. The lights were softer now, conversations looser. My sister was holding court again, her laughter effortless, her confidence complete. She had no idea how much weight she was carrying without realizing it. I drifted toward the edge of the room, close enough to hear but not close enough to be drawn in. Her fiancé's parents were nearby, speaking with one of the planners. I couldn't hear every word, but I didn't need to. The body language told me enough. There was expectation there, certainty. The kind that comes from believing details will sort themselves out once everyone is officially connected. I felt my phone vibrate gently. A follow-up message, confirmation of timelines, of what would happen automatically if certain assumptions were acted upon without authorization. The structure was doing exactly what it was designed to do. Waiting. A strange sense of sadness washed over me then, brief but sharp. Not for myself, for my sister. She had been raised to believe that proximity meant protection, that being chosen meant being safe. She didn't know how fragile those ideas could be when built on things never clearly defined. I watched her lean into her fiancé, her hand resting easily on his arm. She trusted him. She trusted the future they had painted together. I wondered if anyone had ever told her that trust didn't replace due diligence, that love didn't dissolve boundaries, that security required more than belief. I thought about stepping in, about pulling her aside and warning her, but I knew how that would go. She would hear accusation instead of concern. She would defend what she wanted so badly to believe in, and the very people I was trying to protect her from would use that moment to paint me as the problem. No. That wasn't how this needed to happen. This wasn't about persuading anyone. It was about reality asserting itself through mechanisms no one could argue with. I felt the clock again, not ticking loudly, but steadily. Certain points once passed changed the nature of everything that followed. I had learned that lesson the hard way years ago, when a single signature had altered the course of my own life. Across the room, a small group gathered near the stage area, signaling another announcement. My sister's fiancé tapped his glass lightly, smiling as people quieted. My parents looked pleased, expectant. This was the part of the evening where futures were spoken into existence. I stayed where I was, my phone warm in my hand, my expression neutral. I wasn't bracing for impact. I wasn't waiting for chaos. I was waiting for alignment between belief and fact. As the room hushed, I took one last look around. At the flowers, the lights, the faces glowing with certainty. All of it balanced on the idea that what came next was already settled. It wasn't. And as the next phase of the evening began, I knew that once the assumptions reached for something that didn't belong to them, the structure would respond. Quietly, firmly, without drama. I slipped my phone back into my bag and folded my hands in front of me. Everything was in motion now, not because I had forced it, but because it had always been waiting for this moment. My sister found me just as the band took a break, and the room shifted into that restless pause between moments. She approached with a smile that looked practiced, the kind she used when she needed something and didn't want it to show. "There you are," she said lightly, as if we'd been looking for each other all evening. "I thought you disappeared." "I stepped out for a minute," I replied. My voice sounded calm even to me. She nodded, glancing around as if making sure no one important was close enough to overhear. Then she gestured toward a side hallway with her chin. "Can we talk? Just for a second?" It wasn't a request. It never was with her. She turned and walked away, already assuming I would follow the same way she had always assumed certain things would fall into place. The hallway was quieter, The music softened by distance. We stopped near a framed abstract painting neither of us had ever noticed before. For a moment she just looked at me, her eyes sharp assessing. The polite mask slipped almost immediately. "I'm glad you came tonight," she said. "Really. But I need to know we're okay." "We're fine," I said. She let out a short laugh. "That's not an answer." She crossed her arms, her posture defensive now. "I just don't want any awkwardness. This is a big night for me." "I know," I said. "It shows." She frowned slightly as if that wasn't the response she'd expected. "Look," she said, lowering her voice. "I know things haven't always been perfect between us. But you left. You chose your life. I stayed. Someone had to." There it was, the story she told herself. "You didn't stay," I said quietly. "You were never asked to leave." Her eyes flashed. "That's not fair. I was here. I helped. I showed up when things got complicated. And I didn't." I asked. She hesitated, then shrugged. "You were busy. You always are. You're independent. Everyone knows that." The words landed exactly the way they always had, not as praise, as justification. She took a breath, her voice tightening. "I just need you to understand something. What I have now, it didn't come easily. I worked for it. I did everything right." I nodded. "According to whose rules?" She stiffened. "What's that supposed to mean?" "It means I said evenly that you've been playing a game where the board was tilted in your favor from the start." Her jaw clenched. "That's not true." "Isn't it?" I asked. "You were given access, authority, support, without being asked what it cost or who it came from." Her eyes darted away for a split second. "That was all I needed." She laughed again, sharper this time. "You make it sound like I stole something." "You accepted it," I said. "There's a difference. But it still has consequences." Her voice dropped. "You always do this. You make things complicated. You overthink. That's why Mom and Dad didn't want you handling things. You'd have slowed everything down." The honesty of it stunned me more than any insult that night. "So that's it," I said. "You were afraid I'd interfere." "Yes," she said too quickly. Then she stopped herself, her expression shifting. "I mean, no, it's not like that. I couldn't risk things changing. Changing for whom I asked. For me," she snapped. Then she inhaled sharply, realizing what she'd said. The silence stretched between us, heavy and exposed. She looked at me, then really looked, and something like panic flickered across her face. "This is my life," she said, her voice lower now. "I can't afford for things to unravel. Once I'm married, everything will be settled. Safe. Safe." The word echoed painfully. "You really believe that?" I said. She nodded. "Marriage fixes things. It aligns people. You'll see." I felt a strange calm settle over me, the last piece clicking into place. "You think the wedding locks everything in?" "It does," she said. "It has to." She stepped closer, lowering her voice to a whisper. "Whatever you think you're doing, whatever point you're trying to make, don't. Not tonight. Don't embarrass me." There it was. Not concern, not remorse. Fear. I met her gaze steadily. "I'm not here to embarrass you." "Good," she said, relieved. "Then we're clear." "We're clear?" I agreed. She relaxed visibly, mistaking my composure for surrender. She smiled, the practiced version returning, and reached out to squeeze my arm. "I knew you'd understand," she said. "You always do." She turned and walked back toward the ballroom. Her confidence restored, her future secured in her mind. I stayed where I was, watching her go. For years I had wondered if she truly believed the story she lived by, or if she knew deep down how much had been arranged to protect her from uncertainty. Now I knew the answer. She hadn't just benefited from the imbalance, she had depended on it. I didn't feel anger. I felt something colder and steadier. Acceptance. She wasn't a villain. She was afraid. Afraid of losing her place. Afraid of being ordinary. Afraid that if the structure shifted even slightly, she'd be exposed as someone who had never learned how to stand without support. And she had just confirmed something critical. She believed marriage would lock the door behind her. I walked back into the ballroom slowly, the noise swelling around me once more. My sister rejoined her fiancé, laughing easily, her hand slipping into his as if the conversation had never happened. She had said what she needed to say. So had I. Only she didn't yet understand that from this point forward, the outcome was no longer in her hands. The room gathered itself for another moment of celebration, the kind that felt ceremonial, even before anyone spoke. Glasses were refilled, chairs shifted. A soft expectancy settled over the guests as my sister's fiancé moved toward the front, tapping his glass with a practiced smile. "This won't take long," he said, laughter rippling politely. "We just wanted to thank everyone for being here, and to share a little about what comes next." I stayed where I was, close enough to see the expressions change, but far enough to remain unnoticed. My sister stood beside him, radiant, her fingers threaded through his. My parents beamed from the front row, shoulders relaxing as if a weight had finally been lifted. He spoke about plans, about alignment, about how fortunate they were to have families who believed in supporting one another. Words that landed easily on a room primed to agree. As he continued, a woman in a navy suit appeared near the edge of the stage, conferring quietly with the event coordinator. She wasn't flustered, she wasn't hurried. She carried herself with the calm authority of someone who knew exactly why she was there. My sister's fiancé noticed her before anyone else did. His smile faltered just slightly, then returned. He finished his sentence and raised his glass again. "To the future," he said. Before the toast could land, the coordinator stepped forward, microphone in hand. "I'm so sorry to interrupt," she said, her voice warm and professional. "There's a brief administrative matter that needs clarification before we continue." A murmur rippled through the room. My sister frowned, confused. My parents exchanged a glance, the first flicker of uncertainty passing between them. The woman in the navy suit stepped closer and spoke quietly to the fiancé. I couldn't hear the words, but I didn't need to. I saw the shift happen in real time, the way his shoulders tightened, the way his eyes flicked toward his parents, then back to the woman. "What kind of matter?" my sister asked, her voice still light, still assuming the answer would be harmless. "Just a procedural point," the coordinator said, smiling. "It won't take long." The fiancé cleared his throat. "Of course," he said, nodding too quickly. "We can sort it out." They stepped aside together, their conversation low and contained. Guests leaned in, curious now. This wasn't part of the script. I felt my phone vibrate gently in my bag. I didn't look at it. I already knew what it would say. The structure was responding exactly as it had been designed to. Across the room, my sister's future in-laws had gone still. The mother's smile froze her eyes, narrowing as she watched the exchange. The father's jaw tightened, his attention snapping fully into focus. They weren't confused. They were recognizing something they hadn't anticipated. My sister stood alone for the first time that evening, glancing around as if looking for reassurance. My mother leaned forward, whispering something to her. My sister nodded, forcing a laugh that didn't quite reach her eyes. The coordinator returned to the microphone. "Thank you for your patience," she said. "Before we continue with any announcements, we just need to confirm that certain assumptions about future access and arrangements are at this time not authorized." The room fell quiet. My sister's head snapped up. "What does that mean?" she asked, her voice sharper than she intended. "It means," the woman in the navy suit said calmly, stepping forward, "now that some expectations referenced tonight are contingent upon agreements that do not currently exist." "That's ridiculous," my sister's fiancé said, his composure slipping. Everything was understood. The woman met his gaze evenly. "Understood is not the same as documented." A few guests shifted uncomfortably. Someone coughed. This wasn't scandal. It was worse. It was uncertainty. My parents looked bewildered now, their earlier confidence draining away. "I don't understand," my mother said softly. "We've always handled things together." The woman nodded politely. "I'm sure that's been your experience. This is simply a clarification to prevent misunderstandings." My sister turned, scanning the room, her eyes finally landing on me. For a brief moment, something like recognition crossed her face. Then it hardened into confusion, then disbelief. "This doesn't make sense," she said. "Once we're married, marriage does not alter these conditions," the woman said gently. "Nothing has been revoked. There is simply no automatic transfer." The fiancé's father stepped forward, his tone carefully neutral. "We were led to believe there would be flexibility. There will be." The woman replied, "Once appropriate approvals are requested and granted." Requested. Granted. The words landed with weight. My sister laughed again, too loudly. "This is a misunderstanding," she said. "We can talk about it later." "We can," the coordinator agreed. "But we can't proceed under false assumptions." The room buzzed, now low and uneasy. Conversations broke out in hushed pockets. Glasses lowered. Smiles faded. I remained where I was, hands folded, my pulse steady. I felt no rush of triumph, no surge of satisfaction. Only a quiet certainty that something irreversible had just shifted. My sister's fiancé pulled her aside, his voice urgent. She shook her head, her expression oscillating between anger and fear. My parents hovered nearby, unsure where to stand, unsure which role to play. The band remained silent. The lights seemed suddenly too bright. The woman in the navy suit turned to the coordinator and nodded. "That's all for now," she said. "Thank you." The coordinator forced a smile and addressed the room. "Thank you, everyone. We'll take a short pause." No one applauded. As people began to move, unsure whether to refill their drinks or step outside, I felt my phone vibrate again. This time I checked it. Status confirmed. Conditions enforced. No exceptions. I slipped the phone back into my bag. Across the room, my sister caught my eye again. This time there was no mask. Only the dawning realization that the future she thought was locked in had just cracked open. I didn't look away. This was the moment the ground shifted, not with a crash, but with a careful correction. A quiet reminder that belief didn't create authority, and celebration didn't erase structure. The night would continue, of course. People would talk. Explanations would be attempted. But something essential had changed. From here on, the future would have to answer to reality. And reality, I knew, had finally entered the room. The party didn't end, but it stopped pretending. Conversations fractured into tight clusters, voices, lowered smiles replaced by careful glances. People didn't know what to say anymore, and that uncertainty spread faster than any rumor. I stayed where I was, watching the shift ripple outward. My sister's fiancé spoke in urgent murmurs with his parents near the bar, their heads bent close together. His mother's face had gone still, the pleasant warmth drained from it, replaced by calculation. His father nodded slowly, absorbing the implications. They weren't offended. They were recalibrating. My parents hovered nearby, clearly unsure where they belonged now. My mother kept smoothing the front of her dress, a nervous habit I recognized from childhood. My father stared into his glass as if the answer might be at the bottom of it. They had built the evening on reassurance, and that reassurance had just been quietly withdrawn. Someone brushed past me and whispered, "What just happened to no one in particular?" No one answered. The woman in the navy suit spoke again with the coordinator, their exchange brief and contained. Whatever needed to be said had already been said. There was no argument, no raised voices, no accusation to rally against. Just facts settling into place. My sister finally broke away from her fiancé and crossed the room toward me. She moved quickly. heels clicking sharply against the floor, her expression tight with disbelief and something close to panic. "What did you do?" she demanded, stopping in front of me. I met her gaze evenly. "I didn't do anything tonight." "That's not true," she said, lowering her voice. "They're saying things aren't settled, that things need approval. That's never been an issue before. Because no one questioned it before I said." She shook her head. "You knew this would happen." "I knew assumptions would meet reality," I replied. "That's not the same thing." Her eyes flicked toward her fiancé's parents, who were now speaking in measured tones with one of the planners. "This makes us look unprepared," she hissed. "It makes us look foolish. It makes expectations visible," I said. She stared at me, searching for something familiar to grab onto. Anger, guilt, apology. She found none of it. "You could have warned me," she said finally. "I could have." I agreed. "And you wouldn't have listened." Her mouth opened, then closed again. The truth of it landed between us, uncomfortable and undeniable. Behind her, my mother approached hesitantly. "Can we talk?" she asked me, her voice unsteady. "I don't understand what's going on." "We can talk later," I said gently. "Tonight isn't the time." She looked from me to my sister, confusion clouding her face. "I thought everything was taken care of." "It was," I said. "Just not the way you thought." My sister's fiancé joined us, then his expression carefully neutral. "We need clarity," he said. This caught us off guard. "I'm sure it did," I replied. "Clarity tends to do that when it arrives late." His mother stepped forward, studying me with new interest. "You're the one we should be speaking to," she said. It wasn't a question. I nodded. "If you have questions, you're welcome to ask them through the proper channels." Her gaze sharpened. "And those channels are the same ones that apply to everyone," I said. "Requests, documentation, consent." Her lips pressed into a thin line. "That will complicate things. Only if you were counting on simplicity that didn't exist," I said. Silence followed. Not hostile. Assessing. The father exhaled slowly. "We assumed alignment," he said, "based on what we were told." "I'm sure you did," I replied. "But alignment isn't inherited. It's negotiated." My sister looked between us, her composure cracking. "This is my family," she said sharply. "You can't just—" "I can," I said quietly. "And I have." Her eyes flashed. "You're doing this to punish me." "No," I said. "I'm doing this to stop a mistake from becoming permanent." She laughed, brittle and strained. "You always think you know better." "I know what I built," I said. "And I know what it's for." That was when it happened. The shift I hadn't expected. Her fiancé took a step back. Not dramatically, just enough to create space. "I don't know who I'm marrying," he said, more to himself than anyone else. "I don't know what we assumed." My sister turned on him. "Don't do this. Not now." "I have to," he said, his voice low. "Because this doesn't disappear after tonight." His parents exchanged a glance, the kind that held entire conversations in a single look. The mother straightened. "We should pause," she said, "until we understand what we're stepping into." The word pause landed like a verdict. My sister's face drained of color. "You can't mean that." "We do," the father said gently. "This isn't what we thought." Around us, the room buzzed with restrained curiosity. People sensed a turning point but didn't yet know what it meant. I felt no satisfaction, only relief that the illusion had finally cracked where it mattered most. My sister's gaze snapped back to me, raw and accusing. "You did this." "I didn't," I said. "Your assumptions did." She shook her head, tears threatening. "I trusted you to stay out of it." "I stayed out of it for years," I said softly. "That's how we got here." She looked away, then her shoulders slumping as the weight of it all pressed in. For the first time, she saw herself not as the center of a seamless future, but as someone standing on ground she hadn't bothered to check. My parents stood silently absorbing the fallout. I could see the recognition dawning there too. Not anger, regret. I stepped back, giving the space back to them. I had said what needed to be said. As the band packed up and guests began making quiet exits, I felt something settle in my chest. Not victory, closure. They finally understood who held the lever, and understanding I knew was something they would never unsee. Several weeks passed before the quiet finally settled into something permanent. Not silence exactly, but a different kind of stillness, the kind that follows when illusions collapse and no one quite knows what to rebuild yet. The engagement was officially paused, though no one used that word around my parents. They said things like postponed and reconsidered, careful language meant to soften reality. My sister's fiancé and his family withdrew politely, citing the need for clarity and time. There were no dramatic fights, no public accusations, just distance. Meetings that never got scheduled, calls that went unanswered. It ended the way most things like that do. Slowly. Without witnesses. My parents came to see me a week later. They sat across from me at my kitchen table, hands folded, voices cautious. They didn't ask for anything. That alone told me how much had shifted. My mother tried to explain herself, but the words tangled. She spoke about exhaustion, about wanting things to be simple, about believing that giving my sister more responsibility would somehow make everything work out. I listened. I didn't interrupt. I didn't argue. I didn't absolve her either. When she finished, I told her the truth. That being capable didn't mean being expendable. That my silence had never been permission. That my distance had been protection, not abandonment. She cried then quietly, the way people do when they realize too late that certainty has cost them something irreplaceable. My father nodded, his eyes fixed on the table. He said he hadn't meant for things to happen that way. I believed him. Intent had never been the problem. Comfort had. My sister didn't come with them. She reached out days later, a single message that said she needed space. I respected that. Space was something I understood. When she finally did speak to me again, weeks after the party, the conversation was careful and unfinished. There were no apologies. No accusations either. Just two women circling a truth neither of us was ready to name out loud yet. She told me she didn't know who she was without the future she'd built around herself. I told her that was something only she could figure out. I didn't offer advice. I didn't try to guide her. This wasn't my work to do. What I reclaimed that night wasn't a role or recognition. It was something quieter and far more durable. I reclaimed my right to decide how and when I participated. I reclaimed boundaries that didn't require justification. I reclaimed the understanding that love didn't mean access, and family didn't mean surrender. I went back to my life. To work that asked me to think clearly and act intentionally. To mornings that began without dread. To evenings that belonged to me. The engagement party became a story people mentioned less and less, fading into background noise where it belonged. Sometimes I thought about the version of myself who would have walked away that night. The woman who would have chosen peace at the cost of clarity. I didn't judge her. I understood her. But I was glad I didn't become her. Power doesn't always announce itself. Sometimes it waits quiet and patient until belief overreaches and reality steps in. I still don't need to be the center of any room. I don't need credit or acknowledgement. What I need is alignment between what I give and what I choose. And I finally have that. If you've ever been underestimated by your own family, if you've ever been labeled strong so people wouldn't have to be fair to you, you're not alone. Sometimes the quiet ones are quiet because they're building something that doesn't need permission. If this story resonated with you, I'd love to hear your thoughts. Share in the comments if you've ever had to draw a line that changed how people saw you. And if you're enjoying stories about quiet strength, boundaries, and reclaiming dignity, don't forget to like this video and subscribe to the channel. Stay with us. There are more stories like this ahead, and I'd be glad to have you here.